On that day when my people Israel dwells safely, will you not know it? Then you will come from your place out of the far north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great company and a mighty army. You will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. And it will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know, so that the nations may know me when I am hallowed in you, O God, before their eyes. Now this is really interesting because we can read different books about the different plans of men and the different military campaigns that they plan to bring about. For instance, God used the nation of Assyria first to destroy the 10 northern kingdoms of Israel, the 10 northern tribes of Israel. But of course, it was Sennacherib, who was actually the king of Syria, who invaded Israel, thought that he was doing it by his own might and by his own strength. But all along the time, God was using that nation as a rod in his hand of his anger. In Isaiah chapter 10, it talks about how Assyria was used as nothing more than a hammer in the hand of God to punish his people. And apparently, from reading scripture, the same thing is happening right here. Because even the United States, a nation that calls itself one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty, we have kicked God out of our schools, out of the classroom. I mean, we have done everything to God that we possibly could to let him know that we don't want anything to do with him anymore. So now the one nation that God has used more than any other nation in the last 200 years to preach Christianity to the rest of the world has now turned our back on God. So God is going to work in a dramatic way in these last days to let not only us know, but the whole world know that God is still in control, and to get the people of this earth to look back to God as the source of all salvation. But he talks about how when they are gathered in their land, and we know that in 1948 the Balfour Declaration was signed, and it gave Israel the right to go back and occupy the land. Now we know again that was definitely not fair to the Palestinians that were occupying the land, but God again says that he was going to bring all these to pass in the last days. But let me just read an example of some of the different plans that Vladimir Zhirinovsky has for Russia if and when he gets into power. But we know from reading prophecy, if he doesn't fulfill this prophecy, somebody else is going to. But most likely he is going to. He goes on to say, one doesn't have to listen to Zhirinovsky for very long to discover that he is strongly anti-Semitic. In fact, Zhirinovsky is so anti-Semitic that he is being called the Russian Hitler. Excuse me. And was even refused entry by Germany on a recent European trip. Now, you have to be pretty bad for Germany not to even allow you to come in there. With Germany's history, with Adolf Hitler, you have to be pretty bad if they don't even want you. Anyway, Zhirinovsky constantly blames foreigners for Russia's decline, more often than not warning of a Zionist plot. Also, Zhirinovsky's Liberal Democratic Party has received large amounts of financial support from a Russian organization called Pamyat. Pamyat is the largest and strongest of Russia's anti-Semitic groups. According to Ann Simmons in Time magazine of January 13, 1992, Russians are looking for someone to blame for the shortages and hunger that have followed the collapse of communism. And many are finding that all-purpose historic scapegoat, the Jew. In Russia, the umbrella organization for this type of hatred is a group known as Pamyat, which preaches a sacred Russian nationalism, looking toward an authoritarian Russian purge of all foreign influences. Looking forward to an authoritarian Russia purged of all foreign influences. The leaders of one such group is Vladimir Zhirinovsky. Let's take a closer look at some examples of Zhirinovsky's anti-Semitic rhetoric. Although my party is not anti-Semitic, we don't tolerate an increase in the strength of the Jews. It says, I will replace all of Moscow's Jewish television announcers with all blue-eyed Russians. He goes on to say, Jews are infecting the nation. The Jews were to blame for the first two world wars, and it is they themselves who have provoked anti-Semitism. In Russia today, Jewish children are going to school while our children are hungry and forlorn. If you elect me, I will put a stop to it. Now, if you notice, like Ron said before, there are so many parallels between Vladimir Zhirinovsky and Adolf Hitler. We know that when Adolf Hitler, first of all, was in jail before he even started on his campaign to revolutionize Germany and before he started his Nazi party. He was fed the same kind of rhetoric, you might say, in jail as Vladimir Zhirinovsky is being fed right now. And we know that these men are created from day one to fulfill a specific destiny. So he's being fueled with that kind of rhetoric that's going to cause him, when he gets in power, to get together a whole army of nations and go against Israel. And we can see the stage being set right now, even in Bosnia. and the different Islamic nations for this march on Israel. But going on down, he says, in Russia today, Jewish children, okay, I already read that. I myself am not an anti-Semite, but the best outcome would be for a free emigration of Jews out of Russia to Israel. It would be best if they would all go back to Israel. Whenever I am bashed in the press, the article is usually signed by a Jewish name. The majority of the new political parties, unfortunately, are headed by Jews, and a Russian Jew is against Russia because there was anti-Semitism in our country and still is. But we, the Liberal Democratic Party, are not anti-Semitic. And he goes on to talk about how he's not anti-Semitic, but basically how he's going to be used to set the stage for the Third World War. And after this World War, there's not going to be any opposition left to the New World Order that we see in Revelation 13. I have about 10 more minutes, so let's go to Revelation 13 real quick. And I know we've studied some parts of Revelation chapter 13 before, but I'm going to read all the way through the chapter and try to show exactly how the New World Order and the United States and Russia are being used to bring about this New World Order. John says, Then I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshipped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast, and who is able to make war with him? And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority to continue for 42 months, or for 3.5 years. So from the time that this individual gets up and he starts speaking blasphemies, and he starts to wear out and persecute the church, we know that we're going to be given into his hands for 42 months, or for 3.5 years. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. This is the same horn, this is the same power that we see in Daniel chapter 7, that was speaking blasphemies against the people of God. And in the very next verse of Daniel chapter 7, verse 8 and 9, he talks about the thrones being set in heaven. And he talks about a judgment scene being convened at the time when this takes place on earth. This is why it's so critically important for us to understand Revelation 13 and Daniel chapter 7. It's because it tells us exactly what's happening in heaven at the same time. He goes on down to say in verse 7 that it was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. So he was given power over every individual on the face of this earth, every individual country, every individual language, nation, or whatever. Verse 8 says, And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the earth. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. It says, Verse 10 says, He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. In verse 11, he goes on to describe another entity that's working with this beast power. And it talks about how this second entity is going to be using miracles and signs and wonders to set the stage for the other beast that was in its presence. And listen to what it says. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and spoke like a dragon. Now this is really interesting. Whoever this second power is, it represents itself as a lamb, something that's innocent and something that's out to save the world. But in reality, it speaks like a dragon. Who could that be but the United States? And not only that, we're going to go on to show that all through prophecy, when it talks about beasts rising up out of the sea, like Daniel chapter 7 and also Revelation chapter 13, most of the time it talks about the sea of humanity. It talks about a region that's heavily populated. Interestingly enough, Revelation chapter 13 verse 11 sees another beast coming up out of the earth, not out of the sea. If you remember the history of the United States, when the Constitution was signed, and when the Pilgrims and the different other individuals that wrote the Constitution came over here to the United States, it was a rather sparsely populated area.